Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the beginning of another series. And this series is going to be Ethics in the Modern World, part, 700, I think is probably what the total will be, because so many interesting ethical questions keep coming up, and I sort of feel inundated by them, and I finally thought, you know what, I just want to start addressing these. But before I begin, I want to say that for several years, people from Europe have been saying, hey, if you're ever in Europe and teaching a class, please let us know because we'd love to take it. Well, I'm going to be in France in May, and the class will be on the 20th, 21st, and 22nd. That's a Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, or at least it should be. If those dates don't quite line up, then it's the Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, right around the 20th, 21st, and 22nd. It's in a small town somewhere near Limoges on the Dordogne River. Anyway, if you're interested, just send me an email. You can go to my webpage and find a contact form there and send me an email and we can set that up. There's 3 spaces available. Some people have already booked. So if you're in the area, in the region, and would like to take one of my classes, just send me a message and we can work out the details from there. So here we go. Ethics in the Modern World, part 1, again, of probably 700. Now, a whole series of events has caused me to reflect on this. And the core issue here, I think, is we've lapsed in our thinking and our cultures into a habit of thought that is much more strongly associated with morals. This is not surprising, of course, in the West. I'm not speaking for, every culture. I'm thinking particularly my experience in the United States, but I think generally in the West, you have this notion of thinking in terms of morals. Now, there's this important distinction between ethics and morals. And ethos is a Greek word, and it means kind of character or mode of being, sort of how are you? And to be ethical is to express yourself clearly and well and truly. In essence, but it has a more of an emphasis. These aren't black and white issues. They're sort of on a slider. It has more of an emphasis on yourself being expressed in the world. Now, morals, which is a Latin word, tends to have the tone of, it means to be in harmony or to follow the rules of your society. So it has much more an emphasis on the exterior and laws. The big there are many distinctions here, but one of them is you can know whether or not you're breaking a law. This is sort of it causes us to think in terms of legal and illegal, good and bad, good and evil, as it were. And so morals tend to have this notion of, are you doing the right thing or are you doing the wrong thing? Is it the legal thing or is it the illegal thing? And it tends to cause issues and our outlooks to be focused on sort of binary oppositions. Ethos, on the other hand, tends to be much more focused on, is it true? Is it representative of you? Is it cognizant or harmonious with your surroundings and yourself and your surroundings? And so it's a very different emphasis, and it's less heavily weighted towards the right and wrong, good and bad, legal and illegal, and much more heavily weighted towards diversity and variety and variation and all kinds of deviations, because one expects, and one clearly, people are different, and so different people can have a different ethos without actually disagreeing about anything. You don't necessarily have to have an argument to have a different ethos. Somebody can say, oh, I really prefer, as I do, I prefer long walks and reading in the coffee shop, and somebody else can say, hey, I love to play tennis and watch movies. We're not wrong, right? I don't know what it would mean to be wrong in that environment. And so, but is either of these immoral? See, there's no real strong moral judgment to be made here, but there is a strong ethical argument to be made. So that's sort of the key distinctions. So I think too often, and this will come up repeatedly, but I just want to lay the groundworks here, is the distinction between ethics and morals. And by the way, the words are often used interchangeably, which I think makes them confusing. But the emphasis and the origin is quite different, and it's important to keep that in mind, because I really want to look at this notion of ethos, a lot of which comes, not all of which, of course, because we're communal beings, which will come up, comes from us, and then how we relate to society rather than just society has its orders and rules, and am I following them? So what led me, well, a whole series of events led me to ponder doing this series and finally pushed me over the edge. And part of it is, I think, and where to begin was a question, is I keep encountering instances of, I don't want to say wrong ideas, it's ignorance, right? Just when there's, by the way, it's not wrong to be ignorant. There's all kinds of things I don't know. You're always vastly more ignorant than you are informed because it's a very large world filled with lots of people. And so, we're just ignorant of a lot. So that's not really a big issue to me. But the types of ignorance. And so in one day, and this is kind of what the triggering event, as it were, in the morning I encountered someone who said to me, people keep talking about Africa and all this. What has Africa ever done for civilization? And my first mental response, I didn't say anything at the moment, but my first mental response was to say, well, that's just sort of some racist bullshit. And then I paused and I said, well, why would someone know anything about what Africa has contributed to civilization? Because it's, as far as I can tell, almost never discussed. And then later in the day, I had someone say, I'm not sure, I think they got this sort of from the slavery research being done in the U.S. that's sort of become a political issue. And they said, in 1648, the European colonists introduced slavery into the New World and sort of poisoned the New World with slavery. And I'm like, wow, that's as wrong as the whole what has Africa ever done? Sort of wrong in the other direction, as it were. But I think the Aztecs were sort of going, hey, give us a little credit. We were doing some pretty groovy slavery. You can't say what you want about the Aztecs. You can't say they weren't doing slavery. Where I live in the Pacific Northwest, our native, the Salish tribes, the Salish language group, estimates vary, but they probably had around, their society was about 25% slaves. But, these are Aztec slaves were very different from the slaves up here in the Salish Sea. So, but it just really got me thinking, and I thought, wow, how is it that there is just this complete lack of awareness of the sort of cultural history of our world, or of our country in this case, or the world, in the case of Africa's influence on civilization. And then I thought, I'm going to take a look at our media. I'll take a look where if I was watching TV or something, I don't have a TV, but if I were going to watch TV, what would I be seeing? And so I looked at it like, oh, History Channel. What's on the History Channel? And this was sort of when the light really went off. Because the History Channel, as far as I could tell, let's see, they may have been a special, but it was like something about Hitler, something about Nazi super weapons, something about like a giant shark. And then I can't remember the last one, but it was like, ancient space aliens in the New World. It was not history at its highest level, let us say. And this got me thinking, and I thought, wow, okay, how does a history, quote unquote, History Channel, obviously it's not a history channel. By the way, I looked at National Geographic. Theoretically, I thought, oh, they must be doing something. No, this is wrong. And I looked all over. If you had satellite TV, was there anything out there that would have helped inform you? And as far as I could tell, and I searched for quite a while, there really could find nothing that spoke in any way to these sorts of issues: real history, real cultural history, anthropological explorations, sociology, basically the entire world of knowledge about the history and development of human civilization was utterly and completely absent. So I was like, wow, that's sort of amazing. And I thought, imagine you're someone who works at the History Channel. You're probably not a stupid person. You're probably not an evil person. You must know at some level, one imagines that like the person who wrote the show called whatever, Ancient Space Aliens or Nazi Secret Super Weapons, they must know they're writing nonsense, right? They're probably not confused about that, but they don't see that as their job. Their job is to write whatever the producer or the director tells them to write. And the director probably says, I'm just getting paid to do this job. So they want me to come up with some visuals and interviews and stuff that make it look like something about this may or may not have been true. Hey, I can do that. Great. And then the producer is saying, well, I just need a show that gets really good ratings. And then if I get really good ratings, they'll pay me and I can get promoted and I can do something that's more valuable and meaningful, perhaps, or just pays more. And then all the way up to whoever runs the History Channel is just decided, like, yeah, well, we look at our ratings and these are the shows that get the best ratings, so we put these shows on and we don't care. So here's a whole bunch of people who are all getting paid a fair amount of money to produce material for a History Channel, none of which has history as a content. And they must know this, right? They're not confused about this. So what they've decided is that it does not matter to them. This is not important. What the content of what they're producing has no bearing on what they're doing. Their job is to do whatever they're told and to do it sort of with some skill, I imagine, but probably just enough skill so they don't get in trouble and they get paid and maybe they can get promoted or maybe they can go someplace and do something else that they want to do. And this is what raises the whole question of ethos, of ethics. It's not that people are wrong for doing this, but the question is it does it resonate with their ethics? Have they given any thought to this? And my suspicion is no, they really haven't. That what's happened is they've been told or been convinced, not all of them, I'm sure some of them are just perfectly happy, think this is hilarious what they're doing, but I imagine most of them, and this is a pattern that I see repeatedly, is we live in a culture that does not ask us almost ever to think about ethical decisions as personal decisions. It's I don't want to say invariably unasked, but it's hard to think about a time when we're normally asked to ponder or reflect upon the ethical content of what we're doing. And so these producers, directors, writers, camera people, they're just there doing their job as if what they do doesn't matter. Now, that's the key point. The reason I want to reflect and ponder on ethics and why this kind of strange divergence into these weird fields is this. It's pretty clear from lots of psychological research that one thing that really makes people feel healthy, valuable, and important is a sense of efficacy. That the decisions that they make and the things that they do matter both to them and matter to their community. This is why people love to work in teams. And all the research says, if you work with people you like in a team that's doing something that you think is important, that the team thinks is important, you will be happy and love your job, almost invariably. Not quite invariably, of course, because humans are so diverse, but pretty much. If you're doing something, no matter how well compensated for most people, that you dislike with people you dislike, you'll generally tend to hate your job and you won't enjoy yourself or your life, and it tends to be very unhealthy for you. So that sense of efficacy, of having importance and doing something that matters, the it matters comes in part, not exclusively because we're social animals, but in part from you. You have to imbue your activities with meaning. But almost everything in our culture tells us that what we do, that we're cogs in a big machine. There was just a book that just came out. I haven't read it yet, but it's getting good reviews. It's interesting, called The Rise of the Bullshit Job. And it's the notion of why are so many of us participating in so many different jobs that don't seem to really respond or resonate with who we are as individuals. And it's part of a bigger system, I would argue, that has taken ethics and moved it to as far away as possible and sees ethics as something that you should never think about, never ponder, never reflect upon, because it's going to get in the way. So, I mean, of course, I always meditate on education, but, education, they don't ask you really what you want to study basically until you're in college. And even then it's kind of a dubious kind of ask. They tell you what you're going to do. And you sit in spaces often where you know that you don't want to learn this, and the teacher doesn't want to teach this, and nobody thinks the material is important, but everybody has to pretend like the material is important. This is profoundly unethical, not because of the content of what's being taught, but because of being in an environment where everybody feels as if they're not doing what they think they should be doing, or what they want to be doing, or what they think is important. And the idea is always, later, when you get a grounding in education, when you do this, when you do that, when you do this, then at some point you'll reach a stage where you get to start making decisions that really matter. Now, the problem with this, of course, is this is like saying, okay, I want to become a runner. I think I'll run a marathon, right? If you wait, as our system suggests, until you graduate from college or maybe later to make these sorts of decisions, you're really woefully unprepared to make them. I mean, because you haven't been practicing, you haven't been exploring, you haven't been exploring your ethics, you don't know. And so what we tend to do is fall back on those societal goods. These would be morals, the morals of our society that tell us what's good and what's bad. And we go, okay, I'll just do what's good. They say I should get good grades in school, I'll get good grades in school. Or if I don't get good grades in schools, then I'm a bad student and that's bad. I'm not confused about this. This is not morally confusing. This is what our society tells us, and we're perfectly clear on this. And so it has this seemingly simple and profound but deep layer of ethical disengagement, because they tell us ethics is not for us to decide. It's not your ethics that matters, it's not your decisions that matters, not your ideas or your characters or the people you interface. That is not what's important. It's like these other systems, these other ideas, these external forces, these morals, these goods and evils. This is what we should be focused on. And if we can achieve those goods and evils, if I can get all good marks and I can do well in school and I can do all these things and get the rewards, then I am right. Therefore, if I'm right, then my life is good. Ethics tells you this is, of course, an absurd notion. Like being good, not breaking the law, that might be a perfectly good ethical principle, right? To say, oh, like you get in all kinds of trouble, it ruins your day, you have to go to court, the police bother you, right? So, it's probably a good ethical decision, but it doesn't really help that much. Not breaking the rules or fulfilling the rules actually doesn't answer almost any ethical question of note, which we'll, of course, talk about as we go forward. And then I have been thinking this and pondering this and going, wow. So we live in a society where people aren't aware of like the history of civilization, in part because no one feels like it's their job to do this, because that would be sort of an ethical decision. This would be like hey, I want to make a documentary about the influence of Africa on world civilization. By the way, a better statement is not what has Africa done for world civilization. The better question would be, what has world civilization done that wasn't done in Africa? Because really, and that turns out not to be a very impressive list. It's like, it's music, dance, art, painting, writing, architecture, gardening, poetry, music, all kinds of, aqueducts, the list just goes on and on and on and on, not to mention just sort of the genetic origin of our species. And so when you get through that list, you kind of go, oh, huh. Traffic jams, is that good? I guess internet maybe, so it's a pretty full list of things that we've taken from Africa. Let's put it that way, that the world civilization has been communicating with and influenced by those roots for, of course, forever, or the history of civilization. So, but how you can ask one of that question is just to say, oh, we're inundated in a society that is totally no use for the past, right? By the way, this is an ethical decision to just abandon the past, and no real investment in wider historical or cultural ideals, which may be fine, right? But it's a decision that people haven't made individually, but it's being made communally, and everyone's just like, oh, I guess that's right. We don't watch shows on history because for some reason they don't exist. And so, I'll watch something else. But why? Who's making these decisions? Why don't they exist? Doesn't somebody want to make them? Other countries make them. Like, they make documentaries in some countries. It's kind of amazing that explore these issues. But in the United States, pretty thin on the ground. So these sorts of origin questions and very low level. And then it seems like, okay, that's silly. Who cares what's on TV and, documentaries? You can go to the library and get books, and it's not taught in school, but that's fine. Who cares? Then there was an article in The Guardian. I believe it was The Guardian. I'm pretty sure it was The Guardian. And Ireland, good on them. They said they're combining some existing facilities and they're creating 5 new technical universities. Like, all right, so we're going to make a big investment and sort of get some things coordinated. And they're interviewing the guy, one of the people who's leading this effort in Ireland. And they said, look, these are focused on creating the jobs and the economic growth we need for the future. we're not doing a lot of philosophy classes. We're doing medical technology and genetic research and, computer research, this kind of thing. And it's that, see right there, this is the amazing thing to me, that if you just stop there and go, wow, ponder for a second, we're going to create a university or combine resources to make sort of an institution out of existing facilities that is going to do biomedical engineering, artificial intelligence research, genetic research, probably medical experimentation. But they don't need a philosophy department to talk about things like ethics, right? Like this is, so again, it seems like the small, silly side, but then you realize like, oh my goodness, we're going to do biomedical research and we're not going to have any ethics classes. We're going to do, business investment, but we're not going to have ethics classes. We're not going to ponder. We're just not even going to offer them, right? We're a real school focused on real issues, not that crazy stuff out there. And this sort of, I don't even know what to say, to tell you the truth. I'm like, Mary Shelley wrote a book about this, Frankenstein, a long time ago, right? She recognized that you might want to think about the ethics of, biomedical research, right? That might be an issue, just saying. In fact, we're going to spend a couple of episodes, probably 80, I would guess, off the, we're going to spend a fair amount of time thinking about biomedical ethics because, of course, wow, what a swamp, what a crazy, crazy swamp that is. But the notion, the person who was speaking, highly educated, right, is leading up this big educational push. It's in The Guardian. Everybody seems happy about this. They seem like this is the right thing, and they want people to know. Like, hey, just so you know, we're not wasting time. We're not wasting taxpayers' money. We're going to program artificial intelligences, but we're not going to be thinking about ethics because you wouldn't want us to do that as we create artificial intelligence because that would be, wrong. It's almost like it's like they'd somehow misprinted a script from some dystopic science fiction fantasy novel in The Guardian as an interview about these new institutions. But this is absolutely rigorous. And I talked to a friend of mine who went to studied medical research at MIT, and he actually went to the head of the department and said, we have no classes on like biomedical ethics. And he's like, oh yeah, we don't do that stuff. And I was like, so this is not a one-off. I don't want to just throw rocks at Ireland, right? This is a sort of a comprehensive worldview. Business classes, you don't need to worry about ethics. It's not your concern what the business you're working for or the company you work for does. You don't care about that. Your job is to show up, do what we tell you, do it in a nice way, and we'll pay you and get promoted, and that's the deal. You don't ask about the ethical implications of what your company is doing. That's not your job. And in one hand, sure, it would be chaos probably if lots of people were continually debating about the ethics of what they were doing. On the other hand, it does seem like you might want to spend at least a little time, just perhaps, potentially, pondering this. And the results, of course, are terrifying when this doesn't happen. And a couple of examples. Well, one that I love, and I don't want to go too deep on the science route here right off the bat, but science is such a great example of this because, again, they explicitly often state with pride that they aren't wasting time studying questions of like philosophy or ethics. But currently, if you've paid attention to science news, you'll see that everybody keeps thinking that, wow, fusion energy is just about there. We're making big breakthroughs on fusion energy. For the record, in case anybody's keeping score at home, we are not making big breakthroughs on fusion energy. We are nowhere near having fusion energy is so hard, we may never achieve it. If we do achieve it, maybe a long way off. In fact, it's not even clear why we think fusion energy is a good idea. But I'm going to bypass all of that. I'm going to just say tomorrow, fusion energy arrived and they perfected it. It is a totally mature, completely perfected technology. This is, by the way, this is not even vaguely remotely true, but I'm going to give you every possible benefit of the doubt and say tomorrow we've got it down. What would fusion energy achieve? And everybody says, oh, it's free energy forever. Right? This is the power of the sun, free energy forever. It's like, well, define free. And this is where ethics comes in. It's a very simple equation when you move it out of all the technical nonsense, which is where people always try to mire us, and where our culture and our reporting and, again, education tends to want to mire us in the technical details. And that avoids the ethical questions. Can we make fusion work? That's the question. Can we make it work economically? That's the question, as if we know what those mean. But, we ask those sorts of questions rather than, should we do it? Ethical question. Is it worth doing? What would the rewards be? But let's just say tomorrow, like I said, we get the perfect fusion reactor. It's just spectacularly good. And we're like, great. We're not going to use oil anymore. We don't have to use coal. We don't have to get rid of natural gas. We don't have to do fracking. This is going to be wonderful. We'll get rid of regular nuclear. All we have to do is build, 1,000 fusion reactors all over the world. And then we'll have electric cars that plug into a grid that's all powered by this endless, fusion power of the sun. So assuming that one fusion reactor costs roughly what a relatively cheap, nuclear reactor costs today, say around $5 billion. And let's just say we only needed 1,000 of them, that we would need more. But let's just say we only needed 1,000 of them. Well, that's $5 trillion. Free energy, of course, except for the $5 trillion. It would be vastly more than that, because wouldn't be a mature, blah, blah, it goes on and on. But forget all that. And you can ask yourself, if we were going to invest $5 trillion, is fusion really the way to do that? I mean, we could do solar or wind, or we could do, conservation. We could come up with systems that don't need so much energy use. I mean, the sort of the mind reels at what you could do with $5 trillion. That wouldn't involve fusion, which isn't going to work anytime soon anyway, and it's probably a bad idea in the long run. But it's just certainly not free in any case. But that question is never asked. And I've looked at a lot of the research and a lot of the details of this. I've followed it for many decades. And one of the interesting things, every 20 years they announce, or every year they announce, we're about 20 years from fusion energy. And they've been saying that from the 50s. So this is 70 years later, and they're still saying, we're making breakthroughs. We'll get there. Give us about 20 years. So, yeah. But what they don't say, or what doesn't seem to be of interest to anybody, is okay, is this a ethical, good idea, right? Is this an idea that will help promote any of our values, whatever your values are? So this is where you have to stop and think. And you can do this with any subject, even subjects you don't know the technical details on. And that's why I like this example, because it's so abstract and most people don't have a big moral value about fusion. So just say, just fusion energy, who cares? We don't have to know anything about it. And you say, okay, it's $5 trillion. You go, could we think of better ways to spend than doing this sort of expensive, sort of toxic, moderately dangerous, highly resource intensive power generation system? Or would there be a better way to invest that money? And if you think, wow, there might be better ways to do that, then it's not the technical aspects of fusion energy that are interesting or matter to you. It's just the notion of I just don't think it's ethical. And again, we tend to say ethical like it's immoral, but all that ethical means is it doesn't align with your personal values, doesn't fit your character or the character you'd like to see in your community or your society. One reason, of course, that to extend this is that fusion energy is so interested to lots of big players and lots of big investors is it's centralized. And so one kind of ethical question you can ask is it better to have centralized or decentralized energy systems? This is not a technical question because we can do both. This is not a problem. We have the technology and the capacity and the ability to implement both distributed and centralized energy systems. It's an ethical question. How do we want our energy systems to be deployed? Do we want them to be more centralized than they are now? Or would we like them to be less centralized than they are now? And you can ponder that. And again, people go, oh, well, this is more efficient, that's more efficient. No, not really. I mean, you can maybe, if there's massive differences in efficiency, sure, you would go, okay, look, this is, one of these answers is so inefficient and so expensive that the other one just becomes much more reasonable. But most of the time, those are not the kinds of ethical questions we face. It really is, Like, if we have $5 trillion, would we like to invest that in a different kind of technology, deploying technology that exists? Or would we like to, do we want to have a more centralized or a less centralized energy delivery system? And so on, right? So you can think about these aspects without knowing virtually anything about the technological content of this. And this sort of analogy comes up over and over and over again, but we almost never see these debates. We almost never participate in or have this information presented to us in a way that says, hey, this cool new technology is coming along. Here's the implications of it ethically. What do you think? Either we say, here's a cool new technology good, therefore it doesn't matter. Or we say, here's something, it's bad, or here's something, it's good, right? The good and evil thing. It either helps us in a way that aligns with the morals of our culture, and therefore we say, oh, that therefore is good, therefore it's worth doing. Or we say, oh, no, it runs counter the morals of our culture, therefore it's bad, and it's not worth doing. And so, again, the ethical component, the pondering of what the implications of this might be for us individually and for our society communally and for maybe perhaps the globe increasingly is not never asked, but pretty rarely explored. Now, when you see protests often, and these people go, oh, okay, we have protests, and these people are expressing their beliefs in this. And on one hand, yes, like I said, these are not black and white issues. But think of how often our protests really are. That is bad. And what we're on the good side, and that's bad. Or we're protesting, what we have is good, and whatever exists is bad, right? Again, it creates this just simple dynamic where, well, the other thing is bad and what we have is good, or what we, it's that black and white, good and evil, as opposed to really like, oh, hey, we're in a dynamic, complex, diverse system. What are the implications of the various aspects of this and how they influence me, how they influence my community? Yeah, as far as I can tell, we really love the good and evil. But this is not by nature. This is not the nature of societies. This is the nature of our society, or at least in the United States today, and I think other parts of the world as well, where the impulse or the inclination to debate these kinds of things is just never encouraged, right? What forums do we have where we're encouraged to discuss ethics? As far as I can tell, almost zero. And this is so much the case that even when you try to have conversations with theoretically educated people, most of the time what you run into is this desire for people to confirm that we're on the good side. Or are you the kind of person who, do you listen to NPR? Therefore, okay, we all agree we like NPR. So we know that our politics align. And it's just this sort of, can I line everything up where I'm on the good side? I'm doing the good things. I'm with the good people. This is good. Or those people are bad. You don't want you to be one of the bad people. Are you one of the bad people that does things we don't like? Or, Fox News is good. I watch Fox News, so that puts me on the right side of things. And so if you don't, well, then you're wrong. And these are not debates. These are not ethical reflections. This is simply, again, picking up sides and then people wandering around and quote unquote conversations trying to find out whether or not you are on the right team. And it doesn't matter almost what you think, as long as you can identify yourself in some way as correct team, then people are like, oh, okay. And you don't want to raise ethical questions because those become sort of unanswerable morass in some ways. Because you can say, oh, what's ethical for you, that's fine. It's not, we might have different ethics about things, and that's fine, and we can still have a conversation in an environment where we feel okay with that. But if it's right and wrong, then you can't really have a conversation. The only thing you can determine is who's the goodies and who's the baddies. And so, and again, don't believe me, sort of meditate on your own experiences here. Have you, how often have you encountered this openness to sort of really reflect on the implications of things, how they mean, how they actually impact you? How often are we asked to just do things pro forma, which, by the way, in a big society with lots of people, there is a certain amount of like, yep, we've all just got to go along this way to get along to make things run. But that doesn't mean you don't have opportunities, or you can't have opportunities to pause and go, let's think about this. So one of the examples I always liked is a couple of years ago locally here, a school asked each class got to paint their own classroom. And so they'd ask the students, how would you like to paint the classroom? And then the students could paint their own classroom. And they stopped doing that after a while. And I always thought, that's kind of a shame, because there was a moment for the kids to get together and decide how they wanted part of their environment to be structured. There's not really a wrong answer. I mean, it might be unpleasant, right? If they said, it's bright orange, and you got to think after about a week, they'd be like, ooh, maybe this acid green was a bad call. a little visually off-putting in here, right? So you can see, I guess it could go wrong in a little bit, but you're like, hey, if some kids put fishes and some kids put flowers and some kids do stripes, like, hey, great. Like, what matters is not the outcome so much as the fact that they got to participate in helping to design and choose an environment in which they had to exist for a fair amount of time. And so how often are we asked to make these sorts of significant ponderings and contributions to our culture, our immediate surroundings, or even ourselves? The sort of other extent of this, the very personal part, again, is fashion. Fashion is always the great expression of personal ethics. Even if you don't mean to, of course, you have no choice. And so how you dress and how you choose to dress says a lot about either your ethics or your lack of pondering of ethics, right? It's hard to know. And that, the famous thing is the big movement that was, I think, pretty much almost universally successful against fur. Like, hey, let's not kill often rare animals and wear them. That seems like a reasonable position. And so they had this sort of very strong ethic, right? This was one where they said, hey, we really don't want you to do this. We think it's not attractive. Let's stop doing it. But again, the argument was not an aesthetic argument. It was actually a moral argument. This was wrong. But I can see where people's ethics were expressed as, we love the animals, let's not do this. Great. But we don't tend to think of then as fashion as having this huge intellectual and philosophical underpinning, even though it absolutely 100% does. If you're free to dress how you want within, certain societal parameters, then how you choose to dress is, in fact, an expression of your ideas of the world, your ideas of yourself, your priorities, your thoughts. But mostly what we try to do is find uniforms to wear that allow us not to think too much about that. And then people who do dress as if they think a fair bit about this, we tend to be suspicious of them, at least in the United States. I think this is one reason, like Italy, France, these cultures that are famously more stylish is simply because they have a culture that has a general grounding that is more heavily emphasizes the ethical aspects of life, in this case, as expressed aesthetically. I don't think they articulate it that way, either, at least not consciously, but that is the diversity of fashion and communication in fashion and the caring about and attention to this is sort of a cultural investment in the individual aesthetics and ethics. In fact, there's an argument in philosophy, of course, is everything aesthetics, right? Some people say, all philosophy really just boils down to aesthetics. And that's, I think there is some merit there. I often, is it only aesthetics? Maybe not, but there's certainly a lot that has to do with aesthetics. And then there's, of course, people say, well, all philosophy really should boil down to just ethics, which I think is similarly overgrand, but the overlap between ethics and aesthetics is huge and worthy of reflection. And so with those potentially related thoughts, I want to launch this series and say, we're inundated with information, we're inundated with opportunity, we're inundated with all kinds of things, but we tend to be inundated with is opportunities or impulses or, I guess, encouragement to ponder core ethical questions, even though we live in a world, which I think everyone will readily acknowledge, that is changing so fast, has so many new inputs, has, just the diversity of exposure to the world, the rapid change in technology, the vast, quick disorientation of the pandemic, people now, all the remote work that people are doing, and what does that mean ethically, and all the questions that are being raised around all these issues, even when we're in the midst of one period of, I mean, I don't think it's even questionable, the historic change, like the pace of change, the pace of innovation, the pace of just the exposure to new is like, if nothing else, perhaps driving us a little bit crazy. And so you would think it would be really a good time to take a long pause and ask about some of the ethics of what's going on, some of the core issues that might influence us in our culture from these things. We don't seem to do a lot of that, by the way, as I keep mentioning, but that's what I want us to stop and do. So this is we're going to take a pause in each of these episodes. We're going to take one, what probably seem maybe small, maybe even trivial aspect of our culture that were pressed upon us. Things like what's on the History Channel, right? Why is there this no history, for instance, on the History Channel, and how do those people sort of sleep at night when they produce this absurd stuff? And why don't they seem to care that nobody produces much else? You know, it doesn't seem to bother people, obviously, because there it is. Those sorts of small and seemingly trivial, and would be trivial if it's not everywhere all the time. But I think sometimes looking at the small and the specific helps us have a better sense of like, oh, this is what's going on. Here's how I feel about it. Now that I can get my hands on it, or my mental hands on it, now I can decide how I want to react to it, or at least I can understand my reactions more fully. And again, as I said in the beginning, that sense of being able to express your opinions and beliefs in an environment where you have some efficacy really is a powerful psychological aid to, well-being, to health, to mental health, to feeling like you matter and that you have power in the world. Not power in the sense of, I can lord it over the peasants, but power in the sense of, I understand myself at least a little bit, I understand my world at least a little bit, and I can deploy that understanding to influence the environment, my actions, and how some of the things that occur to me, what impacts that they have. And that sense of power, as far as I can tell, grows primarily from this sense of having a core sense of ethics that allows one to act and think clearly in a way that gives, positive feedback in the sense of, that you're having an impact. Very motivational, very grounding, and very health-giving. And so that's what I want to shoot for in a world in which we just get the swirl of ideas and experiences and new. People are overwhelmed. Mental health is an issue. These sorts of problems are undermining people's sense of having a role or power in the world. And the response is, from history, from psychological research, from the Greeks, and from basically every philosophical tradition that we know of, is to say, hey, take a moment, ponder, look at your world, and think about, what do these things mean to you? How should you respond to them? And how can I impose, or at least express, some of my sense of how the world ought to be and how I want to be in it, so that I feel like I have a place, I have my own power, and I belong. So, episode 1 of Ethics. Thank you. And remember, if you're interested in the class in France, this May, somewhere near Limoges in the Dordogne, just go to my webpage. You can send me a message. There's three slots left, and we'll make it work for you. So thank you very much.